Hello! Welcome to our sixth session of our Lenten Bible study series. Tonight we're going to be reading about Jesus' trial before Annas and the Sanhedrin, his own people. Now, as always, the geography of this series of events plays into how we read the text. Over here in purple, you'll see the Mount of Olives where Jesus was arrested, and you see the Temple Mount in the sort of orange rectangle that I've highlighted there. In the blue is one of the traditional understandings for where the high priest's house was. And it seems to me by reading the text in all the different Gospels that everything that really takes place with Jesus takes place in that area. The reason why I say that is because Peter, while it says that Jesus changes from one location to the other, it doesn't seem like Peter leaves a single courtyard in all the different Gospels. So it seems like he went from one location to another nearby location, and maybe that will become obvious as we read. Once again, I'm using the compilation approach. I'm drawing from all four of the Gospels because each one of them contains different details, which add to the story and make one whole thing. It's actually kind of a fun detective story to put all of them next to each other and see what details one left out and how they combine together to make one solid story. So I hope you enjoy hearing this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. So we'll start in John chapter 18, verse 12. Again, Jesus had just been arrested at the Garden of Gethsemane. So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Alright, so let's do some commentary here. John's Gospel alone records the first trip to Annas. So Jesus, middle of the night, gets captured, goes straight to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. One oddity here is right after it says that he's the father-in-law of the high priest, they begin calling Annas the high priest, and they keep on doing that. I checked the Greek on this, and they're even using the same word. So that's weird. One possible explanation is that John mentions that Caiaphas is the high priest that year. That means that they rotate the priest rather regularly. And in fact, Annas had been the high priest from the years 6 to 15 AD. So it could be that Annas retains the dignity of his office, and people call him by that office even after he's left it. Sort of like how Pope Benedict abdicated his position to Pope Francis, but still we call him Pope Emeritus and give him those honors. In American politics and in our culture, we do the same thing to things like presidents, judges, governors, professors. That's sort of an honorific that we give people in light of the title that they once had. So perhaps a similar thing is going on here with Annas, where he was the high priest, but now he's not, but they're still calling him the high priest and honoring him as a person who was the high priest. And so that would explain why the text goes straight from saying that he's the father-in-law of the high priest to then calling him the high priest for the rest of the time that he's being talked about. In any event, right after being arrested, Jesus is brought to Annas. It doesn't say exactly where they are, but for reasons we'll see soon, I think they're in the vicinity of the house of Caiaphas the high priest. So let's keep going. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Alright, so let's comment on this. Jesus is obviously being a little bit, I don't want to say smart alecky, but he's being rather short with Annas here. Annas asked him about his teaching, about his disciples, and it's not like Jesus has been teaching in secret. He's been out in the open all along. And so Jesus basically calls him out on that and says, what kind of silly question is this that you're asking me? Have you not been able to go to the temple all this time and hear me talking? And of course, the policeman for the temple, he hits Jesus, and Jesus basically says, you have no reason to do that. Now they send Jesus to Caiaphas the high priest. Okay, a brief bit from Luke's gospel here. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the house of the high priest. Now back to John's gospel. We're going to look at Peter now. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus, since that disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. Alright, so let's talk about this. It says that Simon Peter is accompanied by another mystery disciple. His exact name, who he is, it's not entirely known, but he does appear at the Last Supper, in this location, at the foot of the cross, the empty tomb, up at the Sea of Galilee, and in John chapter 21, verse 24, he reveals himself to be the author of the gospel. Now, that would make you think that it would be John the Evangelist, because it is traditionally thought that John the Evangelist, the son of Zebedee, is the author of this gospel. But that's a matter of contention. Some people don't think that's the case. Some people would argue that John the son of Zebedee was just a fisherman from Galilee. How would the high priest have known him? And yet other people think that it's more than possible. If maybe his father was a very successful businessman, perhaps he would be known to the high priest. And so it's not entirely clear. In any event, this person knew the high priest, and that's how Peter got into the courtyard of Caiaphas' house. Let's continue. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, saying, "I do not know the man." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your speech gives you away." Then he began to call down curses and swore to them, "I do not know the man." The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Peter remembered the word of the Lord and how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And then he went out and wept bitterly. Okay, so what we've read here is the famous threefold denial, where Peter denies that he ever knew Jesus. And obviously you can see there on the side, I've tried to draw in the details from all 3 different Gospels to show what was going on here. One thing to point out is that some people will say, well, Peter, so timid, he was afraid of a little servant girl knowing who he was. But that really does not grasp the situation that Peter was in. He was in the courtyard of the high priest, whose servant he had just attacked with a sword. And it wasn't just one servant girl who was recognizing him. It was a whole crowd of people who were inquiring of him, "Hey, aren't you Jesus' servant? Weren't you in the garden?" He feels like he's moments away from being found out and being tried for the crime of attacking the high priest's servant. And so he is properly freaking out. Now, that's not an excuse for what he did, but it lends a little bit of context to his choice. If you imagine yourself in this situation, being surrounded by people, this might have been a very new experience for him, being perhaps, about to die and being arrested for this crime that he'd committed. And so he does what he does. He denies that he knew Jesus. He tries to get himself out of trouble. Of course, Jesus is still in earshot, or at the very least, Jesus knows what he did, and he looks at him, and Peter regrets what he did immediately. All the bluster that he displayed at the Last Supper turned out to be nothing. Moving on, Luke's Gospel, chapter 22. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" They kept heaping many other insults at him. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. So just something to point out here was that now we have a date change. We are now the morning of Good Friday. The chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But even then their testimony did not agree." And then the high priest stood up amidst the people and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. So here's something I want to point out. In a previous Bible study video, we talked about Jesus saying of the temple, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, I said it was important to keep in mind the exact phrase he used, because what he ends up getting accused of saying is, "I will destroy the temple." But he never said that. It sounds like the thing he said, but it isn't the thing he said. This is something that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, where Satan said to Eve, "Did God say not to eat any of the trees in the garden?" Well, of course, God didn't say that. He said not to eat one specific tree. And this is something that we see just in regular life. We see this in politics and interpersonal relations. It's just a common tactic to take someone's words and twist them ever so slightly and turn it into something bad. And this can happen also with the church. People will say, well, the Catholic Church says that you have to have as many babies as possible, and you can't regulate your how many kids you have. You can't try to do that. But of course, that's not true. Other people will say, well, the Catholic Church says you have to work your way into heaven. But of course, that isn't the case either. It's always the tactic of the devil to take something true and twist it just enough that it sounds preposterous or evil. And that's the lie that he tries to get people with. And that's what I think of whenever I hear this phrase, this accusation made at Jesus, "I will destroy the temple made with hands, and with 3 days I will build it up." That's not what he said. Then they said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer." Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the glory of the clouds of heaven." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." All right, let's pause again and talk about what we just read. Jesus is asked point blank if he is the Messiah. And at first he says that it's not going to matter what he answers. But then, in Mark chapter 14, you see him saying, point blank, "I am." That again is the divine name given to Moses in the book of Exodus. And so when he says this, he's taking the divine name upon himself again. This is important because it's from Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is widely recognized as being the earliest one. And sometimes people will say that in the earlier gospels, as say Mark, Jesus doesn't claim to be God. But here we have a very clear claim to divinity. And not just that, he invokes Daniel chapter 7, a messianic text prophesying one like a son of man who's going to come down from the clouds and be granted power over the earth. In saying this, he's claiming to be that person. And then in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, he's asked, "Are you the Son of God?" And he replies to them saying, "You say that I am," which is some kind of turn of phrase, which, at least in its context, seems to mean something like, "It's as you said," or "You got it," because everyone takes it as an affirmation. And after receiving that affirmation, the following occurs. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have for witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And then they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and say to him, "Prophesy!" And the officers struck him with their palms of their hands. And that will be the end of our reading today. One last thing to note here is that the action of tearing his clothing is a sign of mourning or great distress, so that's him reacting to what he perceived as a blasphemy. And of course, what Jesus said would have been a blasphemy if it wasn't true. And it was true. It says that they all condemned him to death. One question people have about that is later on, we learn in Luke chapter 23 that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council, and it said that he didn't go along with their plan. So when it says that they all condemned him, does it really mean that all mean all if Joseph of Arimathea was the exception? Well, I think it's open to interpretation as to whether or not he was there at all, because it says he objected to their plan, so perhaps he didn't attend, and so it was a unanimous verdict among the people who were there, which didn't include Joseph of Arimathea. But in any event, Jesus has now been condemned to death by the Jewish authorities, and they're going to take him out to the Roman authorities next. So we'll see you next time.